This video is about Canadian history.
In this video, I'm going to share with you some information about a time period called the Victorian Era. Please make sure you have your note-taking sheet with you. You can stop the video at any time to make notes. By the end of this video, you should know what the Victorian Era was, understand some basic beliefs of the Victorian Era, like identity, morality, and consumerism. The Victorian Era is named after Queen Victoria. She became Queen of England in 1837 when she was only 18 years old. She looked something like this. Victoria ruled until she died in 1901, after 64 years as Queen. The Victorian Era was a time in England's history when Queen Victoria ruled and there was political stability and strict cultural norms. You may wish to pause the video to write that down. When Victoria became Queen of England and the British Empire, the empire was quite big, spreading across the Americas, South Africa, India, and Australia. At the time of her death, the British Empire had expanded significantly, which might not be a surprise considering she was working on it for 64 years. As this map shows, the empire spread across much of the same territory with some significant additions. Please pause the video and compare these two maps. On your note-taking sheet, please indicate 3 large territorial acquisitions for the British Empire between 1837 and 1901. Welcome back. Here are a few of the responses you may have written down. Western Canada, New Zealand, more territory in Southeast Asia, and a significant acquisitions in Africa. Having one ruler in charge for such a long time had a couple of important effects on people living in the British Empire. The first is that it provided political stability. As you can imagine, it's hard to get things done if the person in charge is changing every few years. For example, during Queen Victoria's reign, there were 7 different kings in Germany and 18 different presidents in the United States. The people of the British Empire appreciated the consistency of having just one ruler in charge for such a long time. The second effect is that the political stability encouraged people to seek stability and order in their daily lives. And that included the way people acted and interacted in society. During the Victorian era, a strict set of social norms were created, and people were expected to observe them. If you didn't follow the social rules, you could expect to be rejected by your peers. For example, what you did on a daily basis and who you talked to depended on who you were. In other words, your identity. In Victorian England, your identity was made up of 3 things: your race, your gender, and your class. Whatever your combination of these 3 things, that would affect what you could do on a daily basis and in your life. Let's look at race. In the Victorian era, people were seeking order. Many believed that everything on earth had its own place and that some things were more valuable than others. Many people believed that something called the Great Chain of Being explained which things on earth were more important and which things were less important. Here is a version of the Great Chain of Being. As you can see on the chain, God is at the top, and humans are more important than animals, but less important than angels. Some people living in the Victorian era were so obsessed with organizing things that they created something like a chain of being for humans. This chain organized all the known races of the world into those more or less important. Sometimes the races included different nationalities. You would have things like British as a race, Italian as a race, Russian as a race, and Asian as a race. It should not surprise you to hear that when English people drew the chain, they put British people at the top. At the bottom of this human chain of being were those humans that looked most different from the British, so Africans, Asians, and First Nations people. In the middle of the chain would be those people who looked like British people but were not British. This human chain of being was a very racist idea, but at the time it was very popular and people believed that it was accurate. And please remember, at this time, if your people, and I mean the British, are conquering country after country all over the world, it might make sense to you that your race is better than all of the others. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just describing the way it was. So if your race was quote-unquote British, then you could do and achieve more in the British Empire than if you were African or Asian or another race that was not British. That included jobs, owning property, and voting. Gender was similar. In keeping with the idea that everything had its place, people living in the Victorian era believed that men and women had their own places. For a variety of reasons, the woman's place was in the home. Because she was so much more nurturing and kinder and sweeter than men, so the theory went, the best place for a woman was to stay in the home, keep it clean, and raise children. Men, on the other hand, were meaner and tougher, so their place was the outside world, facing the harsh realities of the difficult worlds of business and politics. Those areas, according to these ideas, were no place for a woman. Please pause the video and take a moment to analyze this image. What indications can you see that the author believes this family benefits from having the woman stay home? Welcome back. So your gender also affected what you could do or not do on a daily basis and in your life. For example, in the Victorian era, it was thought to be inappropriate for a woman to go out in public by herself. If she had to go out, she should be accompanied by a man, preferably her husband, her father, or her brother. The idea was that because the outside world was so harsh, the woman should be protected. One's gender affected their role in Victorian society and the actual physical spaces they could occupy. The last one is class. Communities, upper-class ones especially, communities in the Victorian era worked hard to establish clear divisions between people of different socioeconomic classes. The upper class were the wealthiest citizens, often those who were born into positions of privilege. The middle class was professional men like lawyers, doctors, business owners, and their families. They were financially secure, but perhaps not as well off as the upper class, or not a descendant of an aristocratic family. The working class was made up of people who were trying to get by on a daily basis. They were men, women, and children who worked at low-paying jobs and who struggled to afford the clothes on their back, a roof over their head, and enough to eat. In Victorian society, efforts were made to establish clear divisions between these classes. People of different classes would live in different neighborhoods. Other ways to distinguish yourself from members of another class were the people you socialized with and the clothes that you wore. So in conclusion, in the Victorian era, there were strict social norms that dictated, based on your race, gender, and class, what place you had in society and what you could and could not do. Another characteristic of Victorian England that is important to understand is that there were strict cultural rules about morality, about what was and what was not appropriate behavior. This included speech, manners, and clothing. For some people in the middle class, they desired to be accepted by members of the upper class. Some people in the working class desired to be accepted by members of the middle class. To increase their chances, or so they thought, the people in the lower classes tried to speak and act like those in the upper class. Hundreds of books were printed about how to behave so that people could practice and act the right way when out in public. Another way that Victorians demonstrated their high morals was in the clothing that they wore. You can see from these photos that these dress styles were elaborate and also covered up much of the body. It was considered inappropriate for a woman to be out in public in a dress that revealed body parts like ankles, wrists, or the neck. Men were expected to dress conservatively also, with shirts, ties, vests, jackets, and overcoats. For those living in the Victorian era, and for those who could afford it, clothing was a way of demonstrating your high moral standards. It was also a way of demonstrating your socioeconomic class. The final characteristic of this age is consumerism. Members of the upper class looked for ways to distinguish themselves from the lower classes. They would dress in fancier clothes, they would shop in fancier stores. They would try to acquire things that only the wealthy could possess. Because the British Empire stretched around the globe, people could buy things from around the world. Victorians loved to buy exotic things and put them on display in their houses to demonstrate how well off they were to guests, or even to people walking on the street. This photograph is from a house in Montreal, and you can see all of the stuff that this family has purchased and placed in the parlor for guests to see. Please pause the video and take a moment to analyze this image. What things has this family bought to demonstrate their wealth? Welcome back. Here are a few of the things that you may have noticed. One of the consequences of the upper class trying to outspend the middle class is that members of the middle class tried really hard to acquire the same things so that they could look like members of the upper class. This led to the upper class trying to find even more exotic and more expensive things, which caused a buying reaction among the middle class. And on it went, this sort of buying war between those people trying to look like the upper class and those trying to keep the middle and lower classes in their place. That is our first look at the Victorian era. Hopefully this video has helped you to identify what the Victorian era was and helped you to understand some basic beliefs of the time period. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them in class. Thank you very much.